We're back with Mr. Napolitano. I want to discuss lie number 14. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars, where you basically describe how the Constitution has been so flouted. Flouted. The declaration of war doesn't really exist. It's been neutered by an abdication by Congress. Bruce Fein has written a lot about this,
Right.
and he thinks that Congress has turned itself into an ink blot, and it is abdicating its constitutional duties and responsibilities to the White House, which centralizes power in the White House. Could you explain lie number 14?
I'm a great admirer of Bruce Fein's work, and he has pointed out in an academic and intellectual way the abdication of the Congress of its constitutional role of declaring war. The Congress did a couple things. In reaction to some of the things President Nixon did, it enacted the War Powers Act, which of course he vetoed, and then his veto was overridden. They thought they were enacting the War Powers Act in order to restrain the president. Like a lot of legislation, had the unintended consequence of unleashing the president. So under the federal law, the president of the United States could fight any war he wants for 180 days, mobilize all the human beings he wants and all the material he wants, and doesn't need the consent of anybody. That's a violation of the Constitution. A 180-day war is a war, no matter what you call it. The Constitution says only the president can declare war. After 9/11, President Bush did not ask for a declaration of war. He asked for something amorphous called the authorization to use military force, known by its initials, AUMF. And the authorization to use military force basically said to President Bush and his successors, go after anybody you want in the war on terror, use any means at your disposal. Well, that's an open-ended war. There's nobody to surrender. There's no target identified. Listen, I believe that FDR maneuvered the Japanese into attacking and killing innocent American sailors and soldiers on December 7th, 1941. But as a result of that, he got a declaration of war against three countries. And when those countries surrendered, he lost his war-making powers. President Bush never lost the powers given him by the Congress under the AUMF. President Obama inherited them, and as long as that monstrosity is on the books, every one of their successors will have this absolute power to wage any war they want, anywhere they want. That's not what the framers intended. That's not what the Constitution says.
And you'll apply that to the Vietnam War and Korean War and the Spanish-American War.
I will certainly do that. The Vietnam War was particularly egregious, as we know. And I was on the Princeton campus when you came to the campus to speak against the Vietnam War, and I was wearing a T-shirt that said "Bomb Hanoi," and I still came up and shook hands with you because my views were different at the time. But we now know that Lyndon Johnson and his staff, and perhaps some of the military folks around him, lied about, made up the Gulf of Tonkin incident in order to get not a declaration of war, but a similar Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Go ahead, Mr. President, destroy North Vietnam, because they tried to bomb a ship, which we would later learn throughout history wasn't even there when it was supposedly bombed.
And Korea, which is considered a UN-approved police action. Was that enough?
No, that was not enough, because the Constitution means what it says, Ralph. And when presidents, even with popular support, even in times of emergency, think that they can twist and torture and maneuver their way around the Constitution, that begins a slippery slope, and it is a precedent for other presidents to do the same thing. The most powerful weapon that the president has, after the power to prosecute somebody, is the power to wage war. The courts will interfere with a prosecution. The courts will never interfere with a war. Why? War is the health of the state. War lets the state regulate human behavior. War lets people surrender their liberties because they think they'll be kept safe. War lets the government raise taxes. And when the war is over, do the taxes go down? Do the liberties come back? Rarely, if ever.
Spanish-American War.
Well, I don't discuss the Spanish-American War in here, but we do know from history that the Spanish-American War was concocted by President McKinley because wartime presidents are powerful presidents, and the state is treated with grandiosity during a time of war.
Again, the ship that supposedly blew up in Havana Harbor.
You know, there's a lot of evidence that that ship was blown up by our own people. The Lusitania at World War I. Woodrow Wilson would not let warnings go out to Americans. Don't go on that ship because it's going to go through waters where there are German U-boats. The British begged him not to let Americans get on that ship. He turned a deaf ear because he wanted us in the war. We fought that war for 14 months, and there were 100,000 dead Americans.
You made a strong point of after every war, power is centralized, especially into the White House. Civil liberties are compromised. Fear is spread. In fact, you said the basis of government is fear by the people. So it isn't like we're idiosyncratic here in the United States. My reading of history is all societies and all governments lie to themselves.
Yes.
That's the way they have cohesion. That's the way they can mobilize and control people. That's the way they can live with their misdeeds, okay? So it's hard to find a single government in the world that hasn't got a rationalization for the violence it inflicts on other people.
Well, think about it. The same generation, in some cases the same human beings who wrote, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech," also wrote the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a felony to put the government into disrepute by the use of your words. How could the same people do that? There's a lust, we all have a lot of lusts, called libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. And this draws people to government. It draws to government people that have this lust.
Which gets us right into your strong criticism of the Patriot Act and FISA, the so-called surveillance law, and what happened after 9/11. And lie 16 is the right of the people to be secure. Okay, so you want to elaborate that?
You know, the Patriot Act is the greatest abomination in American history, in my view, talking about legislative history, after the Alien and Sedition Acts. It was passed by overwhelming majorities in the Congress with no debate. Members of the House had 15 minutes to read it. I don't know if you've read it. I've read it 3 times. It takes about 20 hours to read.
It's 300 some pages.
Yeah, and it basically amends so many other statutes. You have to have the other statutes in front of you.
Yeah,
of course. It's impossible to
And
read.
I'm just add to be fair to you. It's the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects shall not be violated. That's lie 16.
That's directly out of the Fourth Amendment. Why is there a Fourth Amendment? Because the King of England and the Parliament authorized British soldiers to write their own search warrants and enter our homes ostensibly looking for stamps, because you had to comply with the Stamp Act, which meant buy a stamp with the king's image on it and put it on every piece of paper in your house. Of course, while there, they would help themselves to wealth and alcohol and food and even the house itself. The Fourth Amendment was written to prevent that. And it says clearly, if the government wants to cross your threshold, it can only do so with a search warrant issued by a judge on probable cause. The Patriot Act allows federal agents to write their own search warrants and makes it a felony for the recipient of the search warrant to tell anyone, a spouse in the home, a priest in the confessional, a lawyer in the lawyer's office, a librarian, we can tell that story, even a federal judge in a courtroom. You can't answer truthfully under oath if you've received one of these self-written search warrants without, on its face, violating the Patriot Act. So this violates the Fourth Amendment, violates the First Amendment, was passed with no debate, overwhelmingly approved and signed with glee by a president who took an oath to uphold the Constitution. In reality, he assaulted it.
Post 9/11 panic in the Congress.
Correct. And President Obama has done the same thing, and again without fanfare and without notice from our friends in the media. Most Americans don't even know that in 2009, after he had been in office for 6 months, he signed an extension of the Patriot Act with no debate, with no warnings. There are libertarians who vote against it. There are civil liberties people who vote against it. There are conservatives and liberals who vote against it, but people are afraid to oppose it because they accept this myth. If you give the government the power, it will keep us safe. It doesn't keep us safe, and it doesn't keep us free when we give the government our liberties.
How would you react to this statement? We're 2 or 3 major terrorist strikes away from a police state.
I fear that the statement is true. I fear that the American public, like generations before us, will accept the nonsense, and it is nonsense, that if we give up our liberties, the government will keep us safe. Meaning a police state could only happen here with public approval, and there would be public approval. President Bush argued, President Obama argued, articulately. Their first job is to keep us safe. They are wrong. Their first job is to keep us free.
Quote Benjamin Franklin.
Those who would give up essential liberty in order to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. If the president keeps us safe but unfree, he is not doing his job and he is violating his oath.
Yeah, people in some prisons are safe.
Correct.
But they're not free. You're pretty hard on George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. For those in the audience who have not been exposed to Mr. Napolitano, let me say this. I have rarely met anybody who censors himself less. I'm going to challenge you.
Is that a good thing that I don't censor myself, or a bad thing?
I'm going to be challenging you with a checklist in a minute to see how far you'll go. But you talked about George Washington as a slave owner, and a very active slave owner.
Yes.
And
the Pennsylvania story.
Yeah, the Pennsylvania story. I mean, you said, quote, Washington punished his slaves by whipping or selling them, divided their families so they can work more efficiently, and provided them with as little means as tolerable. He also raffled off the slaves of those bankrupt slave holders who owed him money. Washington's most gruesome act as a slave owner came in 1784, 5 years before he became president. What was that?
He had the teeth of some of his slaves removed and implanted in his own mouth. He had the toes of some of his slaves cut off. There was no anesthesia at the time, so that they couldn't escape, so that they couldn't run away. And then when the capital of the country was in Philadelphia, and the state of Pennsylvania had said all slaves in the state shall be forthwith set free after 6 months, he and Martha rotated the slaves through from Mount Vernon in Virginia up to Pennsylvania so that they were rotated out before the end of 6 months, so he never had to set them free. This is the President of the United States and his wife engaged in a conspiracy and actively frustrating and violating the Pennsylvania law. Of course, they weren't prosecuted because half the country accepted slavery at the time.
It was legal. Slavery was legal.
Not in Pennsylvania.
And not under natural law, as you point out. You're also very critical of Lincoln, his hypocrisy. You know, the usual historians say, look, these were other times. You have to forgive them this. They at least helped create a constitution with a Bill of Rights. You're more merciless on Lincoln, who you called the tyrant. Could you describe his back and forth with the border states and his position on slavery and what the real cause, you believe, of the Civil War was?
Question. Did the Emancipation Proclamation free the slaves? Answer. It established and permitted slavery in the border states. You really have to read the document before you can understand that. Question. Was Abraham Lincoln interested in freeing the slaves? No. Abraham Lincoln said, I don't care if we have slaves or not. I just have to keep these southern states in the government because my job is to keep the country together because we don't have an income tax. And if we don't collect duties from the ports, and most of them are in the southern states, we can't have a federal government if that money is not coming in. Look, Lincoln arrested 3,000 journalists and publishers and editors in the North. These are not guys with guns shooting at federal soldiers. These are people arrested because of their words, because of what they said about the war. And he had them tried before military tribunals, every one of which was invalidated after Lincoln's death by a Supreme Court that he had just appointed that said the Constitution exists in good times and in bad. When the legislature of Maryland was about to enact legislation he didn't like, he sent troops to arrest every single legislator. He argued against the right to secession, but he caused West Virginia to secede from Virginia so we could have 2 more senators in the Senate and more representatives in the House of Representatives. He was the most tyrannical, most disingenuous, least faithful to the Constitution president we've had in American history. His troops burnt courthouses, raped women, robbed banks, killed civilians on a large scale for the first time in the history of the world, all in the name of a defensive war.
And you say it was the prime cause, was not slavery?
In my view, the prime cause was Lincoln's fear that the government would collapse if it didn't have economic activity from the South, particularly duties and excise taxes collected at every port from Wilmington to Houston. There were only 3 other ports in the country, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. All the others were in the South. They lost 75%, or were due to lose 75% of the income from those ports.
And you mentioned states' rights in your book, too.
States' rights is a difficult argument to make because
on the Civil War.
on the Civil War, of course, because 8 of the states believed that they had the power to suspend the free will of individuals on the basis of their color. An abominable, condemnable, horrific state of affairs about which I wrote in Dred Scott's Revenge, but not something Lincoln was interested in eradicating. If he was, why would he have said to the border states and to New Orleans, you can keep slavery, which is what he said in the so-called Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, of course, a lot of Lincoln's apologists is, he was in the Civil War. His top priority was preserving the Union, and he would do anything to preserve the Union.
Even kill innocents. I mean, if the Constitution prohibits anything, it prohibits executing people without due process.
Do you think we would have lost the Union if he performed with due process and more humane?
I think slavery would have died a natural death, as it did in Great Britain and Portugal and Brazil and France and Puerto Rico, and we would have stayed as a confederation of some sort.
Okay, now I'm going to give you, it's not a Letterman top 10.
All right.
But it may be a top 20.
I'm sure it's more thoughtful than Letterman.
So we want really fast answers. Should corporations be able to patent life forms, genetic engineering?
No.
Okay. There's a 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court that said that was okay. Is the World Trade Organization and NAFTA a impermissible or unconstitutional violation of our sovereignty?
No.
You don't think that delegating to tribunals in Geneva, major decision.
Okay, the delegation aspect is, I agree with you.
Okay.
But the ability to trade with foreign countries because the product is cheaper is my natural right to buy a cheaper good.
Right, but on the international governance parts where they bypass our courts and they bypass our legislation.
Absolutely unconstitutional.
And yet there seems to be no ability to challenge it in the courts. What is your view on standing to sue? You think the federal taxpayers should have full standing to sue?
Yes, I think standing is judge-made law because they wanted to stop the cascade of litigation. The concept of standing, the right of an individual to force a judge or jury to hear a case, has been so limited by judges because they don't want to have to work too hard. They've made it next to impossible to challenge what the federal government has done unless your ox is being gored, unless they're coming after you in some unique, discreet way. Do you remember Goldwater versus Carter? Barry Goldwater trying to prevent the enforcement of a treaty signed by Jimmy Carter, which gave the Panama Canal back to Panama. If a senator doesn't have standing, who does?
So basically, they've shut the people out of the court. So no matter what corruption or waste in federal budgets, no matter the degree they violate the law, it's only the Attorney General that really has standing.
And who's the Attorney General? Somebody appointed by the President.
Right. Military budget, big, wasteful, should be cut back.
Utterly wasteful. Do we need 900 permanent military installations around the world in order to keep us safe? Absolutely not.
You think America's an empire?
Yes, I do. I think America has been an empire since the days of Teddy Roosevelt, a consciously driven empire by virtually every president since him.
Let's take the violation of international law. You think the U.S. chronically violates international law?
I believe that I've documented much of it in the book.
You think Israel violates international law?
Yes, I do.
And the takeover of the ship, was that a violation of international law?
It was an act of piracy. It was a violation of international law that will probably never be redressed in any court.
And do you agree with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who said in 1938 to Congress, whenever government is taken over by private economic power, that's fascism? And you know Mussolini's thesis on this.
Of course I do know Mussolini's thesis. Fascism, in my view, is private ownership and government control, sort of the flip side of what FDR argued about. But when government and private enterprise are in bed with each other like that, whichever of the two is pressing the buttons, that's fascism.
Okay, so how do you define, in that context, the Wall Street bailout by the U.S. government after excessive speculation and draining trillions of dollars of worker funds and mutual funds?
It was taking from the poor and taking from the rich and giving to the super rich that were the government's friends. It was absolutely unconstitutional. TARP was unconstitutional. The Bush stimulus packages were unconstitutional. The Obama stimulus packages were unconstitutional. And as you just pointed out, nobody has standing to challenge them. Even members of Congress, let's take TARP, who were told, TARP stands for a Toxic Asset Repurchase Program. The government was going to purchase toxic mortgages, toxic paper, mortgages that were underperforming, and toxic assets, homes before people were going to be foreclosed. It didn't purchase any. It just gave the money to the Treasury Secretary's rich banker friends. It was an act of fraud perpetrated on the Congress, and nobody in the Congress did anything about it.
How about the two-party duopoly? You have in your book a brief reference to third-party rights and third-party and independent candidates.
I believe we have a one-party system in this country. It is the big government party. It has a Republican wing that likes war and deficits and assaults on civil liberties. It has a Democratic wing that likes taxes and welfare and assaults on civil liberty and assaults on commercial liberties.
Do you think it's also a big business party?
I do think it's a big business party. Before the Civil War, people went to Washington concerned about and boasting about liberty, human freedom, freedom from the government. Since that time, people go to Washington boasting about how I'm going to use the government to make your life better, whether it's authorized by the Constitution or not.
As you know, there are all kinds of state ballot access laws that make it very difficult, not in New Jersey, your state, but in other states, very difficult for third-party candidates independent, just to get on the ballot. They're harassed, their petitioners are harassed, partisan judges make outrageous decisions, and the documentation of that is my former campaign manager, Teresa Amato, who wrote a book called Grand Illusion, the Myth of Voter Choice and the Two-Party Tyranny.
You are the classic victim of that.
What would you do with ballot access laws? In the early 19th century, there were laws in the states that said you can get on the ballot if you print the ballot. I mean, it was much easier in the 19th century, so it had more variety of views.
Right.
What would you do with
Well, it would depend on who I was in your scenario. Can the feds change this? No, this is a state issue, but the states are violating people's natural rights. Your right to go to New Jersey or to go to California and say, I want to be president, and here's why, is violated by the vested interest in the legislature that wrote laws that prevent you from doing that because they don't agree with what you say and because they can't control you. And I don't mean you hypothetically, I mean you, Ralph Nader.
You would agree with the adage that I created years ago, dissent is the mother of assent?
Yes, I would. I would also agree with what our predecessor at Princeton once said, Norman Thomas. I am not the champion of lost causes. I am the champion of causes not yet won.
I can adhere to that. Speaking of adherence, what do you think of corporate coercion in standard form contracts, where they basically have compulsory arbitration, keeping you from the courts, and they don't compete over it? Allstate and State Farm don't compete. Bank of America, Citigroup don't compete. And they're getting extremely draconian in their one-sided coercions. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, the courts have a principle. This is called a contract of adhesion. Take it or leave it. You can't. We're not going to negotiate with you. But if you're suing under the contract of adhesion, any ambiguity is construed against the preparer of it. The lawyers know that, and they have prepared it so there can be no ambiguity. Look, that might be some sort of a violation of natural rights. I would like to think that another insurance company would come into existence that would let me freely negotiate with them, that would put these guys that aren't interested in natural law out of business.
You know, we have a project on this, which really the freedom of contract has been destroyed.
Yes, it
Whether
has.
you have insurance or hospital or health insurance or auto insurance or bank deposit card with the fine print or installment loans.
Suppose I'm British Petroleum and I have a contract with my shareholders to give them a certain dividend. Who is the government to come in and say, don't pay the dividend this month? They're violating freedom of contract.
From that end. But in terms of the corporations coercing consumers, beyond the doctrine of unconscionability, which once in a while you can go to a court and say, hey, my landlord lease has a clause in it that says, the minute I sign the lease, I confess to any judgment in the future.
Correct.
And that's considered unconscionable. Do you think, is that enough? Are the courts alert enough? Do we need legislation prohibiting such draconian one-sided coercion.
We need judges courageous enough, lawyers courageous enough to get those things changed.